We're live on Facebook. That always happens too quickly for me. I'm always still trying to hit the button when it says we're live on Facebook. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm already hearing an echo, so I think I was told that could come from someone who still has their audio on, who is not a part of the program, or your volume is turned a little bit too loud, but we want to make sure everyone can hear all of us very clearly. So if you could maybe crank the audio down just a little bit. Once again, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our part two discussion. I told you, see, we were going to have a part two to our Asian American anti-hate crimes discussion. I am pleased to have some of the same guests that we had from before, so they'll know how to jump right in. I have a new guest as well, though. I have from Rising Voices of Asian American Families, Dim Mang is with us. Welcome, Dim. And Dim, you're not one of the ones who have to keep yourself muted. I want you to unmute so we can hear everything you say. Welcome. Also, Dan Moen, Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Hi, Dan. We have Linda Schleicher from APIA Vote. And we have two professional psychologists, Dr. Xiao Wen Lo and Dr. Jennifer Tang. I'd like to thank you and welcome you for taking out time once again to join us in this conversation. We're going to kind of jump right in from where we left off before. If you missed it before, scroll way back on Facebook Live on the Novi Public Library site, and you can find part one of our conversation. I'm inviting you, if you are tuning in on Facebook and you have a comment, please type it in the comment section. I will try to get to it. I've already mentioned to the people who are on Zoom, type your comments in the chat section and we will respond there. In our conversation before, we talked about Asian American hate crimes. It's on the rise, it still is, and it's terrible. And we want to know what can be done. We want to get it out there and expose what needs to be exposed and resolve what we can resolve. We also talked about microaggressions. We talked about model minority myth, how awful that is. And I was still trying to educate myself. I've actually been thinking about this off and on since our last discussion, because I want to do better. I want to be educated. And I mentioned before, and I'm saying it again, hopefully education helps. You have to acknowledge you need the education. Don't hold back on what you don't know, because then you can't correct it. So that's my goal. So hi, everyone. Did you say hi to me? I didn't hear it. Unmute yourselves, my panel.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, I want to start right in. And if it's okay, can we first, I want to say it's Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So congratulations and happy holidays, or whatever you call it. I think it's a fantastic thing. I know the president issued a proclamation recognizing this month. And I know there's also something going on, a debate in Congress about the Asian hate crime. Someone kind of talk about a little bit of both of that. You can talk about the month and its significance. Let's start there. Dan, I'm going to pick on you first. You're looking at me. Everyone's looking at me.
Sure. Well, it is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I don't know exactly when it was established. I believe it was 2009. And it kind of encompasses basically everybody from pretty much the entire continent. Like I've seen like mixtures of all different groups and cultures. And I also wanted to do a shout out also. I literally only found this out like 2 days ago. It's also Jewish American Heritage Month too. So these two different communities have quite a history with each other. So happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Yeah. And also shout out to the DIA. The DIA is actually doing a month-long celebration. They actually just kicked it off today, I believe at noon. They did the opening ceremony and celebration. And then I believe almost every weekend they're doing like different cultural events and showing different cultures from different parts of the Asian community.
Very good. Anyone else want to comment on that? Or even if you know anything about what the president did to recognize the month? I don't know everything, but there was some sort of proclamation. Does anyone know about that? Or am I putting you on the spot?
Well, there is an Asian hate bill that has been it's been passed, I believe, in one house, and we have to now get it to the next level. So that has happened, and it was successful, like I said, in the legislative house. But you know, and it's but there are other bills as well that are also, I think the HR I call it the 7120, but it's the George Floyd bill as well. So, you know, and I'm not, I don't want to miss that either. So while we will continue to fight for the Stop Asian Hate bill, I think it's important too that we recognize that we also need to continue and put pressure and continue to fight for the George Floyd justice and policing bill, because I think that that's for all of us, you know.
For sure. And I was going to start one direction, but I think I'm going to switch it up a little bit because I want to talk about voting. We're talking about government and rules and laws and things passing. And I know we have vote representatives here. When you encourage Asian Americans to vote, I want to know, and not that I don't know the answer, I just want to hear your response. Why do you do that? What is the goal and purpose? And do you feel that you are represented in government as you should be? That could be a question for what, Dim? Who's with the APIA? No, that's
No,
Linda.
I'm with APIA vote, and voting is extremely important, and I'll tell you why. Because actually, Asians are a minority within a minority. So where if you're out on the East Coast or the West Coast or the Midwest, there's different issues. And there's also, I think prior to us coming on, and maybe the last podcast that you had, we talked about the economic challenges, right? And so when we vote, we let people know that there are issues and concerns within the community. But if the community is all over the place, they get a little bit disenfranchised. And I was looking at some statistics that talked about, for instance, money. So there is I believe that it's a fallacy out there that, you know, Asian Americans make a lot of money. But if you really look very closely, what you'll find is there is a certain population that might make more money than say their white counterparts, but they may live on the East Coast or the West Coast or in New York. And these are places where they're paid more because the rent is higher and there's lots of things going on. What if you come from the Hmong community? Or what if you come from you've been disenfranchised from your own country because of Burma? I think that Dim made a comment about that. There are a lot of Asians that are living literally below the poverty level, and they're not being represented in their communities. So APIA Vote is always out there we do the census, we're out there trying to get the vote out, and we're trying to explain to different communities why it's so important that you do fill out your registration. We even work with people that are interested in becoming citizens, because if you don't do that, if you're not captured in the census, there's 10 years that's going to go by that community is really going to be disenfranchised. And oftentimes the Asian community, depending, and again, it's not a monolith, we've all talked about this, you might not want, for whatever reasons, to be highlighted. You might be afraid to get into the politics, depending on where you came from, you know, because what politics means to you coming from a different country. So there's a lot of challenges within the different communities, but the APIA Vote is inclusive, and we have people from all different walks of life, as well as in different Asian communities. And we're constantly reaching out and trying to educate and just trying to be a voice for all communities, not just Asian, but all people of color.
Absolutely. And then I did hear you mention, Linda, about the different areas of Asia that you come from. And I think before I started off talking about how you identify ethnically, I want each of you to touch on that a little bit again, to refresh for people who are heard before or new listeners, because Dim, I want to start with you because it was pretty interesting to me. I was educated once again, how you identify ethnically.
Yeah, my name is Dim. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an organizer with Rising Voices. Rising Voices. We recently changed our name, and we're based in Detroit, Michigan, and we've worked a lot with API Vote Michigan with the great work that they do for census education and voting education. So I identify first and foremost as Chin, and we're an indigenous group from Burma, also called Myanmar. Either way works with us. And I was actually born in Myanmar. I grew up there for the first 7 years of my life. And then we immigrated over to Oklahoma actually when I was 7 in 2005 through the diversity visa lottery system, which actually came about because of the 1990 Immigration Act, which would not have been possible without advocacy, which would not have been possible without organizing, and not only just Asian Americans organizing, but like all BIPOC people. So I think I think Asian American is such an interesting identity because we don't have one unifying language or religion or even cultural history. Like even within my like Burmese American identity, the way that you perceive your identity kind of depends on your wave of immigration. So my family and I were like one of 5 families when we immigrated, but then I identify as Chin and not really as Asian American first and foremost, but then folks who immigrated, say in the 2010s, actually identify more strongly as Asian American because I feel like in the past 10 years, there's been such a robust Asian American movement. And then I learned about what Asian American meant, the really rich history that we have, the rich history in organizing, especially with Black Power movement that we have in college when I went to U of M in 2016. So I think that kind of like complicated ethnic belonging is something that a lot of people really connect with. Is like when I would tell people who I was, I would have to say Burmese American, but then that's not really right because we left Burma because we're a minority group and we're actually Christian, which is really unusual because I feel like most people would not say that Christians are an oppressed minority group, but in Burma, Christians and Muslims are oppressed. So I think to me, Asian American and like identifying as Asian American has given me a really strong community and a really diverse group of friends and community members to engage with.
Sure. All right, Dr. Tang, I don't think I've heard from you. How do you identify ethnically? I do remember, but you tell us.
No worries. Yes. Hi, I'm Jennifer, and
First, tell us, you can start with there, or either way you want to start. I want to talk about, tell us your practice and what you do and all of that. You can put it all in there.
Sure. Yes. Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Tang. I'm a practicing clinical psychologist, and I'm also a director and owner of a group practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan called Everwell Health and Counseling. And so our vision, our mission is to provide diversity sensitive and culturally responsive care that's also rooted in science-based, evidence-based practices. And for me personally, I identify as second generation Chinese American. So second generation means that my parents came over here. They actually came here for graduate school, and I was born here in this country. And it's interesting, I think there's probably some historical context to it too, because it wasn't until college that I was talking to some friends and they're like, well, why don't you identify as Taiwanese American? Because your family's from Taiwan. The remaining family that's not here in the States is in Taiwan. But I think ancestrally, some further generations back are from China. So, yeah.
Very good. Dr. Lowe.
Yes, I'm also a psychologist and I have a private practice in Ann Arbor. I am a one-woman show, so it's just me. And I identify as first-generation Taiwanese American. And as a matter of fact, I just got my citizenship 3 years ago. And I want to say that for me, so Taiwanese is how I identify ethnically. In Asian American, I would call it a political identification. So that's not a cultural identification or ethnic identification for me, but it's a political identification in the sense that when I say I'm Asian American, that means that I stand with the Asian communities in the United States. Similar vein, I will say I also identify as a person of color, which is also a political identity for me. I identify politically, and when I say I'm a person of color, that means I stand with all the people of color in the United States. Just want to share that.
Okay. Dan?
Hi, so I'm Dan. I'm with CAPA, the Council of Asian Pacific Americans. I identify, I'm biologically Filipino, so I'm actually an adoptee. So I was raised in a community that was 90% white. So I grew up completely severed from my culture. So I oftentimes, when I explain to people like how do I view the world and whatnot, it's biologically I'm Filipino, but culturally I was raised white. So anything that's Filipino orientated is stuff that I've only learned completely within more recent history out of my own research, or because I've gotten involved with the Asian community. Because for the vast majority of my life, I wasn't around a very big, wide, diverse range of communities. And I actually had a conversation recently with another adoptee about this. It was only up until within the last couple of years or so that I fully 100% came in to my own acknowledging myself as a person of color. That's something that I started to learn about, that for transnational adoptees, meaning we were born in another country, but we were raised from infancy in a white culture. We it's that what's called the cognitive dissonance is very real for us. Like when we hear like struggles within people of color communities or Asian communities, it's very, very, very difficult to emotionally connect unless that person themselves are very connected themselves. So that is probably the best way I can kind of describe it. And like we were talking earlier about when it comes to the diversity within the Asian community, I recently found out that technically speaking, I am Filipino, but my family traces to Negros Oriental, which is Ilongo people. So they like there's different languages all over the country. So there's different groups of Filipinos within the Filipino diaspora. So it's complicated. I guess
What
that's
did
the
you
way I can
call,
put it.
what did you say that was? Negro, say that? I thought you were going to say Negro. I'm like, what did you say?
I found out there was a debate. There was
Like,
a
what?
controversy that came out of this island over Twitter. So there's an island in the Philippines called Negros, and blame the Spanish. There's two parts to it. There's Negros Occidental, which is on the western side, which is where the term Occidental comes from, and Negros Oriental, which is the old Latin term for east. So there's an east and a west part. And I found out that Twitter blew up over the name of the island, and there was this petition going out saying you need to change the name of the island, and a lot of people are like, the colonizers did it, we didn't do this. So
Sure. That's funny. Linda, let's go on to you and see how you identify ethnically. We'll come back to you, Dan.
So my name's Linda Schleicher. I grew up in Detroit, and I identify as Japanese African American. So my mother is from Tokyo. She's from Japan, and moved to Hokkaido. And she met my dad. He was in the Korean War. They lived there for a while, went back to Tokyo, set up house, and then eventually came here and came right to Detroit. And I, like I said, I was born here. But I work both within the Asian community as well as in the African American community because I see myself as both. And so I'm really comfortable with that. And but I am learning more and more. I grew up, my mother raised me, and my mother is Japanese. And so many times when you're talking about issues of race and color, believe it or not, she really didn't have the skill sets or the tools to really talk about things that were just commonplace. So a lot of what we would say, we'd have these conversations at the dinner table. They just weren't those conversations that we may have had at our dinner table. So it was like a disconnect. But as I grew up and as I grew older and I had friends and other individuals that I connected with, I really learned like my place and how to be comfortable with who I am. So I, like I said, I'm with the APIA Vote. We are 501c, nonpartisan. And I also belonged to A. Philip Randolph at one time, the NAACP. I worked with LACLA, which is a Latin American labor group. So I've really kind of just, I embrace people and accept them for who they are, where they are, you know, and that's who I am.
Very good. One thing we were talking before we went live is about model minority myth, and I want to talk about that again. Even as negative as it is, I shared my ignorance in not even knowing the degree of hurt, pain, and negativity associated with some of the stereotypes. I mean, I guess it's so wrong to not even think about how stereotypical it is, whether you look at it as positive or not positive. Asians are successful and problem-free. That's some of the things attached to model minority myth. I want people to talk about, why is this dangerous? Why is this wrong? Why are people even thinking that? Who can talk on that? And then I want the professionals to talk about the impact that it has on that. Anyone? I have to call names again. Everybody has their mics turned off. Dim, I'm going to pick on you. You're the new person to this conversation. Talk a little bit about model minority myth and the impact that it has.
Yeah, I can kind of talk a bit about it from like a Southeast Asian identifying person. I think more than anything, I think when you experience it personally, it feels really limiting. Like I think sometimes when you internalize the model minority myth, you feel like you're incapable if you don't excel at school. You feel like you don't actually fit into your peers if you don't excel at school. But then other times when you do achieve things, it's only attributed to the fact that you're Asian American. And I've actually experienced both. Like in my high school, when more Asian Americans actually came into the spaces, and a lot of them were higher earning. They came from parents who made a lot of money. They had access to more resources. They had access to more tutoring. So I think more than anything, it kind of erases any kind of nuance that you might experience your identity with. And it erases the poverty that is very, very prevalent in our community. So I felt like if I identified as a Burmese American, all I could experience was the fact that my parents were working class. My dad is actually a factory worker. He rose up to the ranks as a supervisor. So he actually started off, kind of building parts and being an assembly line worker. And then my mom has always worked as a cleaner. And so that was my experience. And then I would come to school and a lot of our white peers would say, but you're so smart, like your parents must be so well off. And then that wasn't my experience at all. So I think that actually pushed me away from being Asian American, because I was like, oh, I clearly don't fit into this grouping. So I think that is one way in which I have personally experienced the model minority myth, is that it limits who you can be, it limits who you can interact with. And I feel like it really kind of erases some of the other issues, which are really driven by class.
I love that. Who else?
I wanted to add to that, because actually, since our last conversation about just the minority myth, I wanted to go back, that model minority myth, I wanted to go back and review it. So what I found was in 1966, a gentleman with the New York Times wrote about this, and that's where it first came up, right? So it first came up in 1966, and it was really trying to pit a success story it was about Japanese Americans. They're so successful, they're so smart, they're so this, and they're not like the other minorities, right? The others being African Americans, Latino, whoever you wanted to put in that group. So first of all, started to pit people of color against one another. So what I did is I'm looking at this. So at its core, what I found was that this model minority myth is really about manipulating what we think apparently is successful, and who we target as successful. These Asian Americans are successful, but it's just a tool that denies really all people's rights to kind of value their own race-related experiences. So, and that would mean that even with Asians, African Americans, Latino, everyone. So it's hurtful in the sense that it really diverts the key issues that so we're pitting and fighting against one another as opposed to really working together. So I just wanted to say that it's important that we don't get a chance to talk about our own identity, right? Our own, not someone else telling us who we are. But and that's really important, that we get to define who we are and not someone else looking at us and then defining us. So.
Dim, I did see your hand raised, but I do want to, if I can, ask Dr. Lowe and Dr. Tang, either or would like to go next. How is this impacting the mind? What is this doing to people who are under that pressure to either adhere to the accusation or stereotype, or talk to me about the mental impact?
Jennifer, would you like to take that?
Sure, I can start. I think certainly that what happens is then people internalize a sense of shame, if they're not meeting these certain kinds of what they think are inherent, right? Part of the model minority myth is like this inherent intelligence or success. And so there's certainly a level of shame and discouragement. And then I think you further withdraw and isolate because they're like, I can't bring this up even to my parents because, again, there's this perception that there may be something flawed with me. And yeah, I think that it also is tricky too, because then it further feeds kind of a more institutional level. We were talking about like the model minority myth and again, kind of the statistics that kind of lump all these Asian groups together. And looking like, well, look at their either their income level or their test scores, and it makes me think of affirmative action. They're saying like, well, this whole population doesn't need further assistance academically or financially, but then it actually takes away a lot of resources that a lot of individuals might not be able to get because it assumes like, okay, well, maybe I was talking at some point about like, I think maybe it was a Wall Street Journal article or something. And when it broke it down by ethnic groups, it was very different, like, say Asian Indian or Japanese, on one end of the spectrum to, the Hmong communities or other refugee communities. And they're the ones that are struggling potentially financially are lumped all together. And I would add that to bring it all back to the original question, I think that further kind of internalizes this sense of like, difficulty feeling, I guess, helpless in kind of getting the resources that one would need, whether it's financially, whether it's emotional support. I feel like it just leaves the individuals feeling really stuck and helpless. Can I guess make them feel very stuck and helpless.
Sure, I did read where despite having the highest median income of any racial group, Asian Americans also have the largest income gap of any racial group. I still want you to talk, Dr. Lowe, on that and more of what we already covered.
Right. What I want to add to Dr. Tan had said was, so I think there's also the shame, and that was more intro, like within themselves. What I want to speak to is then the interpersonal piece, and especially with their Black peers, then they feel that sense of loneliness because then they are not Black, but they're also not white. And so it creates that in-between place. And so that loneliness feeling that some of the Asian clients that I see also suffer from. And if they were younger, also sometimes I think the jealousy issue. And so they tend to also be the target of bullying, fortunately, from the Black kids. So that's another thing that can also happen. So those were my professional experience, and I want to share one experience that is personal, which is that I was I am on a Facebook page called Black and Asian Alliance Network. And recently there was somebody that posted it's a Black man, and then how he was mistreated at a salon, and then how his the stereotype is the angry Black man. So he didn't feel like he could protest and to argue and then get his money back. And so he shared that with us, and I was thinking how interesting how it works the other way for me as a woman, Asian woman. And the model minority myth, or the stereotype about Asian people, is that then we are submissive, we're quiet, we are polite, we are nice. So I don't get to be the angry Asian woman. Like when something pissed me off and I can't say, hey, this really pissed me off, because then they'll be like, why are you acting this way?
Or why did you even use that word?
Yeah, you're supposed to be quiet and nice. So I just want to say that that's another way that the model minority myth could hurt Asian people.
And type the name of that
yes, I will.
in the chat, if you will, please. Dim, I want to come back to you because you did have your hand up. So please.
I think just being a high
You're
five.
mute.
Yeah, I was.
Or were you just high five? I don't know these symbols. Was that a high five? Don't do that.
I was just agreeing. It's like the clapping emoji.
I've never seen that on there before. Look at.
Yeah.
Dan, I haven't heard from you recently. You have something to say about what
I
we
just
just
wanted
talked
to
about?
quickly, sorry,
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah, anyone, I don't care.
So the model minority myth is a very interesting stereotype because, again, this is strictly just coming from my perspective as an adoptee American. Because there wasn't really a lot of Asians in the community, there wasn't really this idea of, did you know that they were saying this about you, or did you know what they said was actually harmful? So I grew up a lot hearing like, oh, you're so smart, or oh, you're so this. And I actually found out recently, an old buddy of mine I've known since like childhood, he'd always thought I was smart. And it turns out he didn't even know I was Filipino. He's like,
So that means you're not smart. Is that what that means? Is
he
that
thought
what
I
they?
was black
Oh, he thought you were black.
our
Okay.
entire life.
Black and smart.
Yeah, I was on like the call and I was like, okay, I
People
don't know
really
what to
size it
say.
up, don't they?
Yeah, so one of the things I definitely realized when I was talking recently to this other Asian adoptee is that when it comes to that internalization of being called smart or being called exotic, it is almost, it's not impossible, but it's nearly impossible to unlearn that, because since we grew up hearing it so much, there was no terminologies or words to describe like a microaggression or the history of this. It's become so embedded into, for us, for BIPOC adoptees growing up in a white community, where it's just like, oh yeah, I totally take that in. I see it as a compliment. I see it as a good thing. In fact, I actually had this debate recently on my wall with and well, actually, it was more of a discussion with me and some other Asian Americans talking about how trying to unlearn being called exotic and being called a model minority is actually a bad thing. And it was fascinating because all of our perspectives, it was that whole, that it's so deeply ingrained into us to where it's kind of like, it's very, 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 very difficult to say, when they say that you're smart and intelligent, even though they may not even know you at all, that's actually not a compliment. So it's kind of hard to think like, well, if my friend says I'm smart, I have to assume that that is a good meaning versus someone I've never met off the street. And I might have mentioned this on the last discussion that we had, but the one of the things we have to really unlearn as a whole is you cannot read people's intentions. That is impossible. No one can read intentions. Nobody can read people's well-meaningness. I've had that discussion where people are just like, oh, I can totally tell. I could just tell, but it's like, you don't know this person. So how do you know they're being good intended? So it's a lot of that multi-layered complexity that is just very difficult to kind of unlearn. And I still struggle with it to this day. So when people say I'm exotic, or if they say that you're really intelligent when they don't even know who I am, it's really, really difficult to unlearn that and think like, you know, that they might be saying that because of XYZ. And it's like, no, it's because it's me. It's not, it gets down to the individualism thing where it's like, it's me, not because I'm Asian. So that's how it's been impacting, at least for me personally, where I grew up. And I don't want to make it sound like it was a bad thing. It's just because there wasn't other people out there who really understood this or grew up around it. Nobody was able to really tell me and say, Dan, did you realize that you were basically being stereotyped? And it's like, I just took it. I took it and completely embodied it. And it's sad looking back on it. It's actually very upsetting looking back on it nowadays. But at the time, I didn't know.
It's really interesting listening to Asian, we're talking with a group of Asian Americans and your different experiences and how, you know, it's different but similar. And we're going to have later in the summer multicultural exchange where we'll be Asian Americans, African Americans, white, you know, and we'll all talk about some of the stereotypes and some of the similarities. And I think that's another tool to maybe bringing unity and bridging the gap of such diversity in our country and our world. So I appreciate this dialogue that we're having. I know unlike with African American cultures, many don't think, and you touched on this, Dr. Lowe, many don't think Asians will fight back. And it's so easy to target Asians is what's believed. What's your response to this, anyone?
Can I jump in there? I just wanted to add what I noticed also. Whoever is perpetrating, they fight a little bit harder too, because the expectation is I dare you fight back. I dare you raise your voice. So it becomes a feeling of they have to one up you. There has to be a one-upmanship on that. So where someone else might get away with something where the level might go from 0 to 3, for us and for people who look like a certain way, they're pushing that to a 7, to an 8, to a 10. And I mean, you know, that being more escalated because they can't let you one up them. And again, this is more about people being polarized in our, you know, today in our society, that and believing in those stereotypes. And I think again, sometimes people are surprised when you don't react the way they expect you to react. I have a real quick short story. I worked in downriver for a long time. I went in with a dear girlfriend of mine to have lunch. It was at an Asian restaurant, and I walked to go to the restroom. And as I walked past, it was no one in the place. It was just 2 or 3 of us. There was 2 people sitting at the table, and the guy said, do you have sugar? Where's my sugar? And I said, well, I don't know. But he says, and he got upset. He got really upset with me because he was saying, you didn't bring me this thing. And I said, well, when your waitress comes back, I'm going to ask her. And when I went and sat down, I heard his buddy say to him, that's not our waitress. And my girlfriend went up down, oh, sorry. And you have to imagine, this was a while back. I had long black hair, you know, so it was just kind of humorous that he pegged that we were in a Chinese restaurant. The young lady had served him his coffee, but she didn't bring him his sugar. And so when I walked past, he just made that assumption. So, you know, again, someone said intent and impact. And if you get those little things happening day after day after day, the comment of what are you, the comment of things like that, you know, at the end of the day, if you let that sink in too heavily for a child, I would imagine that'd be pretty powerful, you know.
Absolutely. Oh, I so can relate to that. We're not talking about me, but I could bring in some examples with that too. I know where you're coming from. I want to talk about fear. And because a lot of this is going on, it's fearful to me to even think about. How fearful are Asian Americans of being verbally or physically harassed? Speak on your own feelings or people you've talked to, and even maybe the professionals can speak on anyone that they've maybe consulted with related to that. Are you afraid?
Yeah, I can kind of chime in. I think if anything, the fear that has kind of increased ever since the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes has made me more empathetic to other BIPOC people who experience this all the time, especially like our Muslim brothers and sisters, especially like our Black brothers and sisters. I'll just like be walking, and then like some white person will just be walking like towards me, and I'll automatically assume that they're going to say something. Or I think I've become more sensitive to small little comments made now and again, like anytime someone even describes me as like quiet or quietly thoughtful or soft-spoken. And I think it goes back to what was being said about intent and impact. No one says you're soft-spoken or, you know, like quiet to offend you. But because of the stereotypes associated with Asian American women, it is hurtful. And then it makes you think, like, I think for me, it did the reverse, where I was like, okay, like I'm, especially in college, where you felt like you had to speak up for everything all the time, or you felt like you had to be right in the front lines. And that can also be draining in its own way. You really get like advocacy fatigue. But kind of on that fear as well, and on silence, I think Asian American silence there's a lot of cultural connotations around that we never talk about. I know for my parents, they have, especially living in Oklahoma, they're incredibly more fearful, but we never talk about it. So there's a lot of fear, but then there's even more silence, because coming from a country like Burma, the minute you talk and speak up about anything, you genuinely do end up in jail. So that silence is something that I think comes from trauma. So many Southeast Asian immigrants from Cambodia, Burma, Vietnam, the Philippines experience this, where they come from military regimes where the minute you spoke up, you actually genuinely had to fear for your life. But I also want to put a thing in the chat where it's like 5 examples of Black and Asian solidarity. Like, I think that we have a kind of collective, I don't know, connotation with our community where it's also stereotypes that we don't speak up, you know, that there's no resilience. But the Asian American movement is, I think, I think it's really ramped up in the 1950s with the Black Power movement. So I also do want to highlight that, like, we also have a rich history of liberation and fighting back that we can also draw from, that we're not starting from scratch, that this didn't just happen because of COVID, that we can fight back. But it takes a lot of healing. It takes a lot of different types of therapy. Along with talk therapy, it takes community healing spaces.
Very good. I want to say this. I want to ask, once again, I always throw out the question, Asian Americans and African Americans. To me, I thought we're always so different. Can you see my hand, Sila? So it seems like the intent to divide is actually turning into some unity between minority groups, realizing that there are a lot in common. Am I accurate when I say there was not such unity with Asian Americans and African Americans statistically or historically, or when did the unity start to develop?
Gail, can I?
Unless you're Linda.
Yeah. Right, I was just gonna say that's not true, and you know the reason that, because I learned a lot because of just who I am. I always wanted to know, you know, my mom had her friends, her side of the individuals that she socialized with. My dad had his friends, whatever. My cousins they socialized with. But you know what? As I've learned, there's this fantastic Malcolm X. Malcolm X on his front line had a Japanese American woman, Yuri, right? And she went to jail. It was the Brooklyn housing projects. And so she stood up. A lot of people don't know that. And if you look at the picture, unfortunately, when, you know, when he was killed, it was her holding his head. Right. So she was there in the front lines with him. She was here when Vincent Chin was killed. And it was many of that would not have happened if it wasn't justice that happened, but it wouldn't have been pushed as far as it was pushed had it not been for Black brothers and sisters who stepped up and said they recognized that injustice, and they sided with the Asian community when Vincent Chin was murdered. So there have been many times, and you know, this quietness, and I've had to tell people this as well, just because a person's quiet don't question their resolve when they want to do something, right? Just because they don't act the way you behave, just because they don't do it the way you do it, there's still a strongness that someone may have, that internal strength that they have. I think about people like the gentleman that was in the 442nd infantry. They were all Nisei. This is all second generation Japanese that were born here, went and fought in Japan, and then had to come home and then had to go into camps to visit their parents. And there was a wonderful pastor. He was a Baptist pastor that moved his congregation close to those encampments so that he could preach and be with those individuals that were in those. He stood up and said, it was one voice that stood up and said, this is wrong. Right? The same thing with, I think we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. There was one dissent during that time period. So there's always the Asian community has locked hand in hand when we have things that are important in both our lives as we're moving through. That housing was important to Yuri. She continued to be a strong activist. Some of us are a little bit later, and we, you know, as we grow up and as we grow and we learn more about ourselves, become more confident, then we start to step out, right? And we start to do those things. Some are super blessed and get it when they're in college and they're young, but both communities have always stepped hand in hand. The thing is that when you only have one in a sea of 100 or 1,000, it's, you know, a lot of times that gets lost. But there are people out there. And as Dim said, depending on how people came here, if you came here through a struggle, African-American struggle through slavery, I mean, this I call it that glide path, that 400 years, you know, the people that came quietly, they get to the, I always say second or third generation, they're going to be right in step two, but they're a little bit behind maybe right now, right? But there are still those that they're building on the shoulders of people that are talking here today.
Sure.
So, you
I
know,
like
so
that. Yes.
it's happening. It has
Mhm.
consistently happened. It's just that we don't talk about it. You know, Gail, you give us a platform to share that information.
Always will, as long as I
Yeah,
can.
and there will be people that will Google that, right? They'll Google Yuri. They'll Google certain, you know, names that we bring up, and there are books that are out there that they'll wind up getting interested in and pulled into. So so when you say they've been, and I use your hands like one over on this side, one on that side, that's not true.
We're like this.
Yeah, they're like going together there. So
Very
I
yeah,
wanted to
it's
chime in on
different.
that one because when we talk about the cross-cultural support between the different cultures, there is definitely a long history in this country. But like Linda said, a lot of it we're not taught in school. A lot of this, like we get taught late in life. And especially when it comes to like international cultures and other countries, I think the old saying is kind of like European history is kind of the standard, and then anyone else is an elective. And that alone kind of says something. So one example of solidarity that I can definitely recall, there's two of them really big ones. One is the Buffalo Soldiers during the Philippine-American War in 1866. Black soldiers from the United States were sent to the Philippines to fight the Filipinos because they were being colonized by America. And a lot of them actually switched over and fought with the Filipinos. The whole reason a lot of Black Americans were sent there was because it was believed that they would be immune to tropical diseases. So they sent them over there, and they were led by white soldiers because the other belief was they believed that Black people couldn't lead. But overwhelmingly, many of them switched sides and fought against their own oppressor because it was, hey, yeah, no, we're not fighting these people because we know what it's like to be colonized. The other big solidarity that I recently started learning about was about Larry Itliong. Larry Itliong was the man who actually partnered with Cesar Chavez and led the grape strike that became the agricultural movement. And Larry Itliong has been completely wiped from history. Like, I never heard of him. We always affiliate Cesar Chavez with the grape strike, but we almost never mentioned Larry Itliong. And that was one of the first big times that the Mexican and Filipino community in California led a major movement together. And I say this not because it's kind of like, well, what about us? What about us? But it shows right there that the way that we're taught history is from a very, very filtered perspective. And I will throw this out there. Oftentimes, it may not even be necessarily the teachers themselves. It's just what they were taught. And sometimes maybe even the schools like, we don't want to teach that part of our history. We want to keep it in the positives. But then when you look throughout the history of America, it's filled with bloodshed. It's filled with racism. In fact, there was a meme that I saw that I really like, actually, that said, if you are an American, you are either Native American, descendants of refugees, immigrants, or slaves. That's it. And it is very difficult for us to kind of picture that because growing up, there was a sociology class I had in high school, and it showed how this idea of not teaching our history has really impacted everybody, including white people. There was a student I remember to this day that was like, Dan knows his heritage. Well, of course I know my heritage. But she was like, I don't know what I am. I'm like this, and this. I'm a mutt. I don't know what I am. And it showed to me that it was kind of like, you have the options that you can learn, but a lot of my history has been erased.
Yeah.
So it's showing how it's this whole like filtering system that we have with white supremacy and how it gets into everything really, really messes with everyone involved. Like these people are completely like my white students, they were completely robbed from what they could know about themselves. And then I was put on a pedestal as if I was a representative of the Filipino community. And I had to constantly explain to them, I'm like, I don't know anything that you're asking. So it's interesting because like we were saying, it's a lot of it just gets so filtered and filtered and filtered, and then we get taught a certain perspective, and that was the gold America. This is what people want. This is why we're such a great country. But the minute we talk about the internment camps, we talk about what happened to Hawaii, how it got overthrown and their monarchy was completely destroyed. When we talk about these different parts of history, it's it makes us really question it. And I think it boils down to that we have to be uncomfortable or comfortable with being uncomfortable. But many people don't want that. They just really want to stay in a safe bubble, including the people who are even oppressed themselves. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's hard for me to unlearn what I've been taught. So yeah, it's
good.
interesting.
Yeah. And I did hear you mention the word, and often it's thrown out there and people automatically cringe when they hear white supremacy. And I think once again, it comes from lack of education, of even understanding what non-whites are talking about necessarily. I'm not saying I'm not going to give any credit to it, but explain that a little bit more, the white supremacy aspect. So when people are listening, they can connect it to more than just a certain thing that makes them cringe, and maybe instead educates and enlightens and showing the impact of the world. Who wants to talk about the white supremacy? It's touchy, huh?
I'll be happy to take that one.
Great.
I will say it in a very simple way. So white supremacy is a belief that white people are superior to other racial groups. It's as simple as that. And then our country, the United States, is then built based on that ideology. And so it's then baked in the system. And so it's not surprising. I would say it's intentional that we learn about white history, but not history of other people. So I would say that. And if you will allow me, I want to tie this back to a little story. And then I appreciate that Linda brought up Yuri. So this is also an example of, I think that we need to preserve our history, because white supremacy is not going to do that. And I also think that, yes, there has been alliance cross groups, but that history is not documented and recorded. And my example is that I remember, I don't remember how many years ago though, but I saw that picture Linda was talking about. Yuri was holding Malcolm's head when he was shot. And I was thinking about, who is this woman? I want to know her. What's her name? And I remember I typed in Asian woman, Malcolm X. You know, I couldn't find that information until she passed away.
Yes.
And then her name came up, and then that image was there. And it took me years to finally find her, and then to be able to read about her and their relationship. So I wanna just add to what Linda had shared. And we gotta be able to speak our histories, preserve, and then talk about that.
I wanted to just say, I was on a program not too long ago, and they said something that I really like. So I had the opportunity to go to South Africa before COVID, right? And I loved and there was an African proverb that when I was doing a program, I've got to read it to you guys, because it says, until the lions have their own storytellers, hunters will always be the hero in the story. And that was the first time I had
so heard. Good, isn't it?
Wasn't that I love
One
that.
more time, Linda, say it.
Yeah, did everybody hear that?
Say it again.
It was, until lions have their own storytellers, hunters will always be the hero in their story. So we've got to learn that. And I love social media in this, and I'm terrible at it, guys, but it is so essential because it's capturing stories, and it's capturing these things for the next generation. And also even for someone like me, who's Googling and learning more and more and more. And I think it's a very empowering. So Gail, when they have these kinds of conversations, when this will be looked at again, it's very empowering to people that maybe don't feel they have a voice. So,
something I'm looking, I have all my little notes and questions. I've lost all of that. I'm enjoying what we're doing right now. I do want to make sure we have enough time to talk about what can be done. Maybe we've touched on it, but I want to zoom in a little bit more. What can be done on a national scale, or a state level, or a local level, or a community level, that can turn things around where people get it? Does it need to be forced through violence? I'm not an advocate of violence. Does it need to be more vocal? Is it just a matter of voting? I mean, we've tried everything.
I
No, it's a
think
Can anyone name some tools or something we can do to impress upon people? Oh, we haven't tried this yet. Let's try this.
I think for me personally, in my opinion, we have to basically hit every single avenue. White supremacy, because of its history, has been embedded in every facet in every culture on the whole planet. That's a quote that I heard recently from somebody, and I really admire that because, again, it's very easy for that cognitive dissonance to come in to say, I wasn't there. That's my ancestors. I'm not responsible. I'm not this. But the reality of it is everybody can be an agent of white supremacy. That means like how we say how there's anti-blackness in the Asian community, how there's that internal racism. It has to hit in every facet. So it involves politics, it involves voting, it involves making sure people vote, making sure that taxes get spread to areas that have been historically excluded. um, I'm just going to plug this in real briefly. I did it on the last one. I'm going to do it again here. But media and TV shows, very big. I'm actually leading with a team of about 35, very wide, diverse range of people, BIPOC and LGBT overwhelmingly, for a TV show based completely here in Michigan. And it takes place in the midst of the pandemic of 2020. And it's a fictional story in a fictional town with a fictional family, but all the main characters are this wide intersectional groups of people, and it's going to focus heavily on mental health and focus on the impacts within these different communities. So it has to come from every single avenue. It has to come down to having more diverse people at the table, at the community boards, talking about what can we teach in our grade schools. It needs to go into representation, into the politics, and especially on a local level too. It's not just having an Asian president, it's you need an Asian president, you need Asian representatives, you need constituents who are also of different wide diverse backgrounds and intersectionalities. It has to hit pretty much everywhere because there's such a long history of this. And you could easily say, even before America was formed, white supremacy was boiled down to the idea of this: we are the chosen people. In fact, Dim, you were talking a little bit earlier about how Asians have been historically clumped into one big group. I can put it in the chat group, but one guy to start doing a little research on is a man named Blumenbach. Blumenbach was a scientist from Germany who was one of the first people who actually coined the phrase Caucasian because of the fact that he found this one particular skull, his favorite, and it happened to be from the Caucasus region. Therefore, he believed that if Adam and Eve were born pure, this person must be pure, meaning these are the high chosen people. And he divided the world up into subgroups. Like, I'm going to just put it there. Again, this is educational. I don't like the terms. They're not used anymore, luckily, except for Caucasian, interesting enough. But Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, and there was one more for Native Americans. And he coined these, made a book. It went wild and people loved it. And it was accepted. This is where pseudoscience, this scientific racism started to come from. And this clumping of these massive diverse groups of people into these categories started to erode. And when you speed up through history to the modern day, this is how it gets perpetuated over and over and over and over. And it gets into politics. It gets into where do the taxes go? It gets into redlining of districts, where it historically has barged the poor area from the wealthy area. It's very common to go across the street and see houses go from being practically burned to this mansion. And it's like, why is that the case? It's our history. We're not necessarily responsible for what they did, but we stand in the shadows of those who came before us. And it's up to us now to learn that and to undo all of it. So it really, it's a multifaceted, complex thing that includes exterior change and interior change. And it's gonna be difficult and it's gonna be uncomfortable. So.
Good. Pretty good. Dim, I don't think I've heard from you in a little bit. Would you like to join in on what we're talking about now, or anything else you want to add with our conversation? Please, I encourage you to.
Yeah, I completely agree with Dan in that the solution is like in every single facet of American life. And I think that's because white supremacy is so widespread, which is also a part of the reason why we have to tackle model minority myth, because the model minority myth seeks to separate all the BIPOC groups whose one common enemy is white supremacy. And I think like the most immediate and tangible way that folks can get started in kind of fighting against white supremacy is to organize. I think that is something that everyone is capable of doing. And when we say organize, we don't mean like you have to be tied to an organization, you have to do this and that. For example, I would actually say that my parents have been organizing their whole lives, in that whenever new Burmese immigrants would come into Tulsa, they would go visit the home, give them some food to start off with, give them some basic pots and pans, tell them which Walmart to go to, or like which school district to go to, what school supplies are. And these little small decisions we make to help our neighbors, that is also organizing. And I think that is something that every single person in America should feel that they have access to do, but especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks, Asian Americans, for example. I think that there's so much solidarity is the only kind of antidote to white supremacy. And I think we can't forget that. But I also think to a certain extent, living in the US, I think it's really easy for us to not really talk about US imperialism, not talk about the fact that, like, why are there so many immigrants in the US? Why are there so many wars that the US is a part of? Like, American intervention, American imperialism is a huge reason why, for example, I'm even in this country, the reason why my parents are in this country. So I would also really encourage folks to just like maybe every day, like when you read the news or when you go on your phone, search up a different region of the world every day, search up a different country and just see what's happening. And I feel like global solidarity is so often overlooked because it's seen as this like far-fetched thing that we don't have access to. But I actually think it's inherently connected to the Asian American experience. It's connected to the Indigenous, Black, Latinx experiences. I'm going to put an article in this chat that actually really helped me look into how global liberation and collective solidarity is kind of the antidote to a lot of these systems of oppression.
Very good. I'm trying to keep up with all these chats. They're going by so fast, but I do see one and I want to catch it before it leaves my screen. It says, what can mental health professionals do to better support their Asian American clients? Dr. Tang, I don't think I've heard from you most recently. Let's get that from you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say that one thing to do is be able to kind of open the floor to have those conversations. I think our assumption as trained professionals is often this like, oh, let the client take the lead. If they want to talk about racism, if they want to talk about their cultural identity, they will. But in this case, if you're saying like, you're not a person of color, that they might not know if it's a safe place, they don't know if that's something that's open to discussion. And so it's okay to kind of put it out there, and it's okay to make mistakes too. Potentially that could have been a client too. They might say like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. They're like, I just wanted to let you know, that that's something that's totally here. I'm here to support you no matter what that looks like. So yeah, I think it's okay to kind of bring it up. Also not making assumptions, not saying like, oh, well, I had one Asian client say this, so then I must assume all is like that. And then I know this is not the question, but I wanted to say like, just because someone's a person of color doesn't mean that's the only thing that we assume to talk to them about. It's like we don't talk about race with our white clients, right? It's like, why not? So I think it's okay to have these kind of discussions all the time. And to bring it back to Gail's question, I think that's my main thing is representation matters, making sure that these just become the norm, that we just talk about these things. It's like, why is it that this feels like this dirty word or thing that we shouldn't be talking about when it comes to racism or white supremacy or white privilege? So yeah, that's just my 2 cents anyways.
Very good.
What I will add is to educate yourself. So this needs to be a long project. It cannot just be a one-time thing. And so if you haven't attended workshops, read books, start to do that and consult then maybe with Asian American colleagues. To better yourself so you can support Asian American clients. And I also think that I don't believe I can adequately support an Asian American client without also have a deep understanding of how white supremacy operates, right? Because we've been talking about this through and through today. It gets into their psychic. So we cannot help them without them even understanding how white supremacy operates. And I want to add two things that I think everybody can do, which is that, so since white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to others, then what we can do, take that simple idea and then learn to then change it, meaning everybody is good and has something to contribute. So then maybe ask your libraries if they can buy more novels or children's books that is about all other people. So we can start from there. It can be a tiny little thing that we do. We don't have to be an activist per se, right? And then the second thing I want to offer is that, so in the Ann Arbor, Ypsi area, so if Novi folks would like to drive in, we have, I put it in the chat, is the Race Dialogue. It stands for Reconciliation and, no, Race and Conciliation Encounters. That's what RACE stands for. And the website is racedialoguewashington.org. They are not offering public dialogues now because of pandemic, and because of the way it's set up, we didn't think that virtual would do it because it's pretty experiential, and then we feed off of the essence from each other when we come together. So they have been holding off for a year now, but once it's safe to go back, they're gonna get started it back up, and then you can get on their website to learn more about what it is, and it is free.
And if you are on Facebook, Dr. Lowe, I'm not sure if you're, I think I saw you type something in Facebook, or somebody did. We're gonna put that on Facebook as well if you, we have it in our Zoom chat box. So I'll put it there if no one else can. Yes, I want to, and let's talk more to the mental health professionals, because I want to talk about people who are being accused of being white supremacists, or white people in general who are saying, this is just overwhelming. This is too much. And I know people who are not professionals can have our own response to that, but I want to hear from professionals that where white people are saying, we don't know what to do. We're not racist. Help me. I need mental help to pull all of this together. Show me the reason for empathy. How am I not showing empathy? What else do I need to do? I'm overwhelmed. What can you say as professionals to people clients who may come to you with that concern? So I'm talking about white people, non-Asians, non-Black. What do you say?
Yeah, I think
that's an off-guard question, isn't it?
Yeah, there was an NPR article, I think, that kind of summarized the book White Fragility, that I feel like a lot of individuals appreciate kind of reading it, and say first to start to unpack their involvement in terms of racism and whatnot. Then it's a sense of that's not whether if we've been racist, any of us, whether white or any person of color, if we've been racist, but how, you know. And so kind of allowing ourselves, and I think, again, I say it, it's like this dirty word, people assume like, I'm not a racist, you know, but because of the system that we've grown up in, we certainly have internalized things. And so kind of recognizing that, I think there's this assumption, or we perceive that racism is when someone is directly attacking someone. When you hear the news where someone's like physically assaulting someone, when they're telling them go back to China or whatever, they see that as racism. But we were talking about like the model minority myth and microaggressions, and, you know, that sense, and these assumptions, you know, that we just say like, oh, well, how long have you been in this country? Your English is so good, you know. Again, that like these kinds of comments, they're still so insidious. And so I think just kind of allowing yourself to read things like there's an article by Peggy McIntosh called The Invisible Knapsack. And it talks about privilege, you know, recognizing that there's things that we carry around we don't even realize. You know, Dan was talking about shows, you know, you can turn on a TV and see people that look like you, and their family, their everyday lives, you know, they're not tokenized like, oh, okay, the only time I see someone like me, it's they're a foreigner, they can't speak English, or they're, you know, fetishized, or, you know, or they're doing some sort of martial arts movie. So yeah, I think just kind of allowing space for all of that. Yeah.
Sure. I can so relate. You look back at some, I know African Americans, we look back some of the shows we used to watch as young children, that were African American centered. It's like, I can't believe I used to watch that. Once you become much more educated, it certainly makes a difference. Dr. Lowe, I'd like to hear from you as well as with the question.
I would validate that it is overwhelming. And that speaks to how pervasive white supremacy is in our culture. And there's so many places that are affected by it. That means there's so much work. So I'll validate that and then ask them to see where they are at, where they would like to begin. And then from there, we will look at resources. And I put it also in the chat, Zoom chat, that there's a conference called the White Privilege Conference. That would be a good place for people to go and then learn, to start somewhere, and also find communities, meaning for white people to find communities, white people who want to do this. And I want to say that white supremacy is not just about white people. Any person of color can uphold it too, right? And so this is not just about white people. So when we say we want to dismantle white supremacy, it's not anti-white people, it's anti-white supremacy, this particular ideology that is not true.
Very good. That's very good. Oh, well, so we're just about winding down, aren't we? I don't want to go over too long, so we're going to start to give some closing statements if we'd like. I do want to emphasize that it's going to be this summer. We're still working on a date. There will be dialogue with Asian Americans, African Americans, white, whatever you identify as, where we all will get together and talk about what we're talking about now. And want to encourage you to listen, or if you'd like to even participate, email me, ganderson@novilibrary.org. As many as can. I think we're going in the right direction here with our dialogue. I also want to get in, you know what, I'll get the latter part later, but talk some more with me. I don't have any more questions, but we have about a few more minutes, 5 more minutes. Everyone want to take a minute? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, come on, let's take a minute, Linda. Tell me a little bit more.
Oh, just in putting all summarizing, the last question you asked was what can we do as well? And I'm a big proponent of education, and I also am very sensitive to the fact that talking about race is uncomfortable for a lot of people, and a lot of times we think we've gotten over something, and it's like a scab, right? You pull that scab off, and all of a sudden you realize you are not as flexible as you thought you may have been. You may not have been as open as you thought you were. So I just want people to understand that this is not about us and them. This is about all of us working together. And if we keep in mind that, I said this in the beginning, that the core ideology of that model minority myth, or any myth about any other race of people, is really about keeping us separated, keeping us fighting with one another. And I think that if we try to get past that and learn how to work together, we're going to be stronger. And yes, there will be uncomfortable times, and I think they are happening today. We see it every day. And there's crazy people out there doing crazy things, but there are really some good people out there too that really just don't know, and they want to help. They want to move past this just like we want to, and they want to grow. So let's be kind to each other. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Instead of just automatically thinking that they're just out to get me. Although there are people out there like that, but just being, understanding that all of these stereotypes are to divide us. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Dan, closing statement.
I think for me, it pretty much sums up what everyone said beautifully. It really is so multifaceted. You can do really large things like protest, get out, get involved in politics, and so on and so forth. Or you can do small things like go to your local library and do some research. I would also add in there getting involved with different nonprofits and groups. And anybody really could make that big change. In fact, a very good buddy of mine is an example that I love using a lot. We had a conversation a week before a protest that he actually helped conduct because he felt, as a white guy, he's like, I don't have a place to have a discussion over race. The following week, he partnered with 2 Black guys and they worked together and created this massive protest. The first time in their town, over 1,000, I think hundreds of 200, 300 people showed up. And that showed to me that it was just like something in him drove him. And he did it to where he allowed them to have the mic, let them do the speaking. And all he did was used what he could to help create this. So even though someone may feel like, I don't think I can really do much, they can do little things, they can do big things. Any type of movement helps. That's really what it boils down to, is anything really will help.
Very good. Dim, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I also just echoing what everyone said. I think we have to really learn about these systems. Like, yes, there are individual cases of learning and individual cases of like oppression and harm, but we have to learn, like, even just like, if you don't know what white supremacy is, Google is a great resource. Your library is a great resource. There's always organizations who are doing great work. A lot of the ones that are, you know, in this panel, whether it's like APIA Vote, a lot of the therapists, I'm learning a lot through Dan as well. And so I think for me, I guess I'll just close off by saying, like, I really hope that people take away from this that we are not only stronger together, but like we cannot do this work separately. Like, white supremacy is something that we've all internalized. It's something that we all struggle to do. But at the same time, I guess if this is something, I kind of want to end on a hopeful note, but I've seen from my little sister in her class, she's 15, so very, very young. Was born in 2005, very much of the TikTok generation. I don't know if anyone is on TikTok. I recently got one a couple months ago. And just the sheer amount of knowledge that's being disseminated across like 13 to 25 to 50 to 60-year-olds on TikTok is incredible. Just everything on social media, there's so many infographics, so many organizations. I feel like there is so much hope for the next generation that's coming up. Like, for example, I one time told my little sister, just be careful at night, especially after the wave of anti-Asian hate. And then she actually just retorted back to me, you know, like, why don't they fix themselves? Why do I have to be careful and people can't, you know, not harm us? And I think that is both a sad and kind of happy experience I had, because I was like, she knows who she is. She knows that she's strong, and she feels so comfortable in her identity. So I have so much faith in young people. I have so much faith in older allies. I have so much faith in just the movement building that's happening. And then I'll put 2 more links in the chat in case people want to kind of like snoop around on things that they can get involved with.
Very good. Dr. Tang.
Yeah, I would say that my biggest takeaway, my message I've been trying to tell myself, and then, you know, anyone I come across, is that it's okay to be uncomfortable. I guess some will say get comfortable being uncomfortable. I would just say just be okay uncomfortable. It might still be uncomfortable, but just do something. So whether that is, you know, you're like, I've never heard that term, I don't know that history. That's okay, right? Part of it is because we weren't taught this. Like, let's help educate ourselves, you know, or like, I don't know what to say. Will I offend my friend or a family member by asking questions or speaking up? Once again, we wouldn't know, we wouldn't be able to better understand these circumstances or how people are being affected by these things unless we talk and have these dialogues. So yeah, just kind of pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone. I think the worst thing we can do is be are in action and not do anything about it and avoid it and continue with status quo.
And Dr. Lowe.
I'll end by sharing one quote that I learned from the White Privilege Conference, which is that we means one more person.
Very good. Like that. It's my turn. We're about done. I love this. We're going to keep this going on and on. You know, I love the comment, it's not us and them, because we are one. We just have to learn that we are one. Each of you mentioned libraries. Check out your library. Visit the Novi Public Library and ask for resources on some of the things that we're talking about. Your own, if you're not from Novi, that's one area that you can look for resources. I also heard about faith, keeping the faith. I believe keep the work going, as well as that, keep the faith. Better things are ahead. We have to believe that, and we're going to work toward that until it does happen. I also want to mention, we're going to talk about another cultural situation that's going on. There's travel restrictions in and out of India, and that's really impacting community. And I always say I want to spotlight things that are impacting community. So May 18th at 6:30 p.m., there will be a program on Asian, Indian fears, fears for yourself, fears for your loved ones, pandemic stress and concerns. There will also be mental health professionals there as well, and a conversation and dialogue. Once again, it'll be May 18th at 6:30 p.m. I just literally got the text of the confirmation date, so it's not on our calendar yet, but check by Monday, it'll be on the calendar that you can check that out, and be supportive, be a listening ear, ask questions, because we certainly want to embrace everyone who hurts. I believe when people hurt, we should hurt. When people heal, we should heal. That's a part of unity. So I love everybody. I love you, you know, and I'm never afraid to say that. So keep the faith, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We have a little bit of daylight left. That means it's starting to ease towards summer. So get out there and enjoy some of that this Saturday. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.